Ryan Davies, who appeared before this committee and brought that complaint to this committee's attention. Were you aware of that complaint?
I was not aware of that complaint at the time that I testified.
Mr. Shakevich said, and his committee has been saying it all along, we parliamentarians are in a conflict of interest making our own rules about how elections are conducted. What's your opinion on that?
And it's an interesting question.
Submit to this committee from the last election, the 45th general election, the number of sworn affidavits on a per riding basis that were signed in order to allow electors who could not provide proof of their citizenship, their age, or their address on a riding-by-riding basis to this committee.
The implications could be very significant, especially as we prepare for a possible election that can happen at any time.
Complaints about potential violations, potential serious violations of the Canada Elections Act, complaints that raise issues that go to the integrity of our elections and how they are being handled.
Mr. Chair, with all due respect, I think it's premature to draw those conclusions, but it is not. But if I may answer, I would like to answer, please.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
To Standing Order 108 Sub 3, the committee is meeting in public for the first hour in the actions of the Longest Ballot Committee. I would now like to welcome our witness for today's meeting from the Office of the Chief Electoral Officer, the Chief Electoral Officer himself, Monsieur Perrault. So we'll turn to Mr. Cooper for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner, for returning to committee once again. I want to pick up where you just left off in your testimony because I had received a copy of a complaint that had been sent to Elections Canada from Ryan Davies, who appeared before this committee and brought that complaint to this committee's attention. Were you aware of that complaint?
I was not aware of that complaint at the time that I testified before the committee. Of course, I am now aware of the complaint.
Okay. Now, the complaint states, among other things, that there were potential violations of the Canada Elections Act by the Longest Ballot Committee. The complaint includes various pieces of correspondence, as well as a photo of an organizer who was collecting or appears to be collecting signatures in which the candidate's name is blank. In other words, if that is accurate, if the picture is fully accurate, but it certainly appears that the candidate's name was blank, that electors were signing a nomination paper for a candidate that would be then filled in after the fact, which would not be consistent with the Canada Elections Act. So what was the status of the complaint? What happened to that complaint? Do you know?
So all complaints, after an election, we receive thousands of complaints, and whenever they allege a violation of the act, we don't scrutinize to determine whether there's adequate evidence or whether there's actually an offense under the act. We typically transfer that, as a matter of course, to the Commissioner of Canada Elections. So, and she has the mandate to investigate violations of the act, contraventions of the act. And
in the case, and I appreciate that, in the case of Mr. Davies' complaint, was that forwarded to the Commissioner of Elections?
So that's an interesting question. She is seized of the information in the complaint. The complaint itself, as I learned after the testimony, and I asked to search for that complaint, the complaint itself was caught in our security filters because of possible contamination of the links. And so other people who saw the evidence put forward, or the videos put forward by Mr. Davies, did make complaints, and the Commissioner.
So just to be, so I'm fully clear, the complaint essentially, Mr. Davies' complaint, went into a black hole. Insofar as it was sent to your office, to Elections Canada, and because of whatever issue, it sort of went into a black hole, is effectively what it sounds like to me happened.
I would not, Mr. Chair, describe it in that manner.
Well,
As
I guess with the greatest respect, and I understand these things sometimes happen, but there was a complaint. It sounds to me like no one looked at it. Is that accurate, or did someone look at it?
So
When did anyone in Elections Canada first look at it?
So the complaint was received, and other complaints preferencing the videos made public by Mr. Davies were received. The commissioner was seized of that information and the allegations, but if you're asking, the physical complaint itself was not transferred, but she is seized of the matter.
So by being seized of the matter, what do you mean by being seized of the matter?
She understands the allegations.
When did she first understand the allegations that were set out in the complaint? Was it after Mr. Davies appeared before committee?
No, first of all, Mr. Chair, I cannot speak for the commissioner. What I can say is her office was seized of the issue at the time that, in short time after. We're talking about July, if I'm not mistaken, after the election. And as a matter of course, these issues are forwarded to the commissioner's office. She receives, just to be clear, from the public and Elections Canada, around 18,000 complaints. 2,000 of which are close to were forwarded by Elections Canada. And as part of that, and there was no significant delay, her office was seized of the information that Mr.
Can you undertake to provide the committee with the chronology of what happened with that complaint, when it was identified, and when it was transferred, or when the commissioner became seized of that complaint? Because it sounds to me like something went wrong with the complaint in terms of what happened on the part of Elections Canada. You would agree? I mean,
I certainly agree that something unusual happened with the complaint, in the sense that there are security parameters around our systems, and if there is concern around the links or documents, they are quarantined. But in this case, the information was also pointed to by other complainants, and they were transferred. And I can commit to share with the committee the time in which these were transferred to the commissioner. I can't speak beyond that. What happens in the commissioner's office, of course, is not for me to speak to.
When you appeared earlier this month, you talked a little bit about the impersonation ban and that it needed to be updated since artificial intelligence and disinformation have become more prominent. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what the rule is and why you think it needs to be updated?
So right now, it is an offense for someone to purport to present themselves as being the leader of a party or the chief electoral officer. But that's not what deepfakes are about. Deepfakes are about presenting that person as saying or doing something which they have done, either in audio or a video. So there's no impersonation that takes place in a deepfake scenario. And I think what we have to be concerned is the manipulation or creating a synthetic content that we see with deepfakes that make leaders or candidates or the chief electoral officer appear to be doing certain things or to be in context that they really weren't.
So what would you propose?
So I think that certainly the offense right now needs to be modified. I have made some specific recommendation to that effect. I've shared that recommendation to the Hogg Commission, which supported, to change the provision to include the misleading. There's very specific language that I don't have in front of me in section 480.1, which currently is for impersonation, and it does not include satire, but it includes impersonation with the intent of misleading electors. And I think the similar concept should be used where it's the manipulation, the alteration of an image or voice with the intent of misleading or interfering with the electoral process. Okay. Leaving aside satire, for example. But that's one of several recommendations that I made.
In June, the Quebec National Assembly passed Bill 98, and I guess that enters into force next year. There's a ban in that bill on spreading false information about election activities, the nomination process, the voting process. Just wondering if you think that the Canada Elections Act should be amended for having similar provisions, and if so, what would that look like?
So thank you. Mr. Chair, I did make a similar recommendation, though more broadly worded in my 22 report, and I repeated that in my report in the context of the foreign interference. I do think there needs to be a prohibition against someone who knowingly presents or publishes false information so they know it's false, and they do that with the intent of entering the electoral process or undermining trust in the process or the results. But it has to be a high threshold of intent and knowledge that the information is false. My recommendation is a bit more broadly worded than what we see in Bill 98.
Okay. How much time? Okay. So the Canada Elections Act right now does not require third parties to submit audited financial statements verifying that no more than 10% of their revenues are used for political activities. Both you and the Hague Commission have indicated this raises concerns about transparency. Can you elaborate on what that risk is and whether we should be looking at having third parties being required to do these kinds of audited statements?
Certainly, that's been a long-standing concern and one that's difficult to tackle. But third parties may be individuals, they may be groups, and sometimes these groups are funded by all kinds of organizations. And while there are limits and restrictions that they can't use foreign funds, as we know, money is fungible, and it's hard to know where it comes from. And when they report, what we've seen over the years is increasingly third parties report expenditures as being their own. And they're their own because they were given for a general purpose, often for a cause, but not specifically for these particular expense in an election. So that becomes their own money, and it's reported as such, and we don't know what the source is. So my recommendations is that groups be required, groups that raise more than 10% of their revenue from donations, essentially fundraising entities, that they have to have a separate bank account, and that they put those donations there with the source of the donation. So when they use the money for an election, we know where it comes from. And that, of course, also addresses some concerns about foreign funding.
Talking about amendments, possible amendments to the Canada Elections Act to make it more difficult for non-serious contestants to get their names on the ballot. And this is to avoid the abuse that we've seen in the last couple of elections, political stunts, really, orchestrated by a group that calls itself the Longest Ballot Committee. Now, one such change that is being proposed, we've talked about it already, you mentioned it in your testimony, to make it more difficult to get the 100 signatures by requiring that they be unique signatures. Now, if we make that amendment to the Elections Act, would it withstand a charter challenge? Section 3 of the charter gives everybody the right to participate freely in an unfettered way in our electoral system. Would that withstand a charter challenge? We put the same question to your predecessor, Mr. Kingsley. This is what he said. I think amending the Act for 100 unique signatures would sustain a challenge that a challenge would not succeed in overcoming the requirement that there be unique signatures. We want to hear from the current CEO on that.
So I don't speak as a lawyer or a judge, but I do believe that it would meet that threshold. As we know, rights are not absolute. To the extent that there are restrictions here, I think they're necessary to protect the integrity and the sanctity of our electoral process. The requirement would not so much make it harder, but more meaningful, that people would not sign on simply because they want as many candidates, but they would have to turn their mind to the particular candidate at issue. And I think that's the concern here. And I think we've seen that there is a need for some restriction. And if it's not going to be a deposit, which has its defects, then it needs to be something else. But there needs to be some protection against the system being taken hostage. And
I think we all agree that there needs to be something, but my question is whether we would withstand a charter challenge. Mr. Shukevich actually did challenge the $1,000 deposit. Thank you for raising that. In a 2017 case that appeared before the Alberta Queen's Bench, and he was successful. But he also challenged the 100 signature requirement, and there he was unsuccessful. The judge says that's perfectly reasonable. But now we're raising the bar. We're proposing to raise the bar to make it more difficult by saying that they should be 100 unique signatures. And I know you can't read the mind of the Alberta judge, but it would have been a different question put to her at that time.
In my view, it only makes it very marginally more difficult for most candidates who don't rely on groups like that. And so for most candidates, it would not significantly impact their rights. It's only, I think, when you reach a certain level, and now we're at the level of over 200 candidates, that, to reach that number, it would put a brake on that. But the benefit of this measure is that it would limit that without really significantly limiting people who truly wish to be a candidate. And that wasn't the case with the deposit, right? It had a bit of an irrational impact. There's no rational connection, the court found, on the deposit and the seriousness of the candidacy.
Understood. Good. Just a couple of minutes still?
A minute and a half.
Okay, so I'm going to go into something else that Mr. Shakevich said, and his committee has been saying it all along. We, parliamentarians, are in a conflict of interest, making our own rules about how elections are conducted. What's your opinion on that?
And it's an interesting question. I mean, there's no denying that there's an interest in any parliamentarian in the rules that govern their election. I don't think anybody would deny that. I think it's interesting that when you look at the history of changes to the legislation over the last 25 years, two things stand out. There's often an attempt to secure cross-party support. It doesn't always succeed, and it shouldn't be a rule because it shouldn't be a requirement for unanimous consent because that would give a veto to the opposition, which I don't think is fair. But the vast majority of changes have come from really the vast majority have come from recommendations of chief electoral officers, which come from a neutral source, often following consultations, including consultations of political parties, and they're examined in this committee, and they're disposed of one way or another, and certainly not all have made their way to the legislation, but many have. And I think that process is a healthy one, and I think that's something that needs to be maintained. It does not prevent additional changes, and I've seen some very good changes over the years that have not come from chief electoral officers. So I'm not saying there's a monopoly on wisdom here, but the fact that there is a process for a neutral policy intake and a cross-party examination of that neutral policy intake, I think, is a good system. It's provided for in the legislation, and it needs to be maintained.
Thank you so much, and I ensured you got the 10 seconds that I took from Mr. Cooper.
So I wanted to also talk about the scope of the misinformation and the disinformation that happens. False claims about voting times, locations, procedures, and election results. You mentioned Quebec passed Bill 98 in June, which will enter force next year, so we don't have the information yet. That'll have a ban on spreading false information about election activities, nomination process, and the voting process. Is that something that you, as Elections Canada, then will look and see what kind of results and use that as a bit of a study to see if this can be scaled up?
Certainly, and we share experiences with all electoral management bodies across the country, and we meet regularly and talk about these things. Of course, mis or disinformation has been an important topic over the recent years, especially with the growth of social media and the decline of traditional media. So we do talk about these things. We did see, and I say that in my report on the election, we did see an increase in incorrect information. Now, we monitor only really information as it relates to the electoral process. But we did see some cases that were troubling. For instance, there was a case where a Journal de Montréal article, a fake article, it was an image, said that we had changed the voting day because of lineups, because for 60-year-olds would vote on the Tuesday instead. Now that was very quickly taken down, but it is the kind of thing that is troubling and that can mislead electors and hinder their participation.
I appreciate that, and that kind of protection then would say consequences would happen if you catch somebody. Right now, the laws that exist are really only within Canada. Is that the case? How can we stop not only someone from inside the country doing this, but how can we expand that outside of Canada to make sure that misinformation and what you mentioned it can't be done, because now you're talking about different jurisdictions?
So this is a complex issue. There has to be some nexus to Canada for the offence to be caught. So if somebody's saying something about a subject matter that's done elsewhere shouldn't be caught. But the real difficulty is not so much in crafting the offence, but it is in enforcing across jurisdiction these rules. So that will remain a challenge no matter what. That's why it's important to have relationship with social media platforms and to be able to rely on those relationships to take down. And the example I gave, the information was immediately taken down. So sometimes the rules are important, of course, but you need more than the rules to ensure a healthy electoral process.
So the relationship with those who are the companies that are spreading that information, let's say your social media giants, you have that relationship and you're requesting for certain things to be taken down if they're false, and they are responding?
We've never requested for what we call a takedown. We typically avoid that simply because it's seen as state censorship. We make them aware of the problem and the dangers of the problem, and we expect that they act accordingly. And in this case, they did. I know that takedowns have been asked elsewhere, and I think the Commissioner has asked for takedowns, but that's nothing that we've had to ask. When we've seen, and often simply correcting the information or downgrading the prevalence of the information on the platform is sufficient, and I have examples of that.
Right. And there would be two steps to that. One, for them to admit, yes, we will change this information or take it down, and two, the speed counts. If it's an election cycle itself, misinformation getting around quickly, speed is of the essence too. So is there any way of enforcing or asking for precedents?
Absolutely. And the regimes with offenses are after the fact are not particularly helpful in that regard. They of course create a deterrence, but it's the ability to make the platforms move that in real time that's critical.
And then my final 30 seconds, I'll thank you because I think in addressing this, you mentioned that flooding the market with the proper information, which is the importance of journalism, to make sure that that's a more supply of information from our independent journalists is important. That's something that stick with me. So
yes, I think it's important. We've really strived to put out as much as information as possible, correct information about the process in the last election, and we're going to continue to build on that. Increasingly, platforms have their own AI chatbots, and that's both an opportunity and a challenge because they're fragmented. I think it's an opportunity if we flood our website with correct information that they will be caught. So we can use that, we can leverage that. But one of the recommendations that I've made is that AI chatbots be required to point when a question relates to electoral process issues, and increasingly people don't do a search, they ask a chatbot to provide the information, that they be required to point to authoritative sources of information. So in the case of a federal election, that the bot would be required to point to. They could provide the information, but it would also have to direct the elector or point to our website.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
In your exchange with my colleague, Mr. Cooper, you suggested and intimated that the complaint submitted by Mr. Davies somehow got caught up in what I would presume is your safety firewall of your email system, and but only fortunately because other people had followed up, and Mr. Davies is a public figure to a certain extent, you were able to get what you needed in order to pass along to the Commissioner. So will you let us know, have you asked your systems administrators to investigate and report back to you, and hopefully then you could report back to us what measures you're going to take to mitigate and make sure that complaints that are serious will not be missed this way again?
So, thank you for the question. So yes, I have spoken to my team and asked that it be examined so that we make sure that if there are serious complaints, that they are not lost because there's a question mark as to the the security of the link or of the document. So yes, I've spoken to my team in that regard. I would add, though, as I said in my opening remarks, that in the case of allegations that signatures were opposed to a document without the name of a candidate, that there is no offense under the Act.
That's
and
fair.
That is something that needs to be addressed.
That's fair. I appreciate that. I'm just going to move on quickly here to make sure that Mr. Jackson has some time. Would you undertake, Mr. Perrault, to submit to this committee from the last election, the 45th general election, the number of sworn affidavits on a per-riding basis that were signed in order to allow electors who could not provide proof of their citizenship, their age, or their address on a riding-by-riding basis to this committee?
Mr. Chair, electors cannot swear an affidavit to prove their own
Then I want the number of affidavits that were sworn by. I understand how it works.
There are different circumstances in when it was sworn statement is made. It can be an elector attesting to another elector. There's also when somebody registers at the polls, they do attest that they are a Canadian citizen, 18-year-old. So there's that attestation. So I just want to be clear here. I'm not resisting the request.
Both.
So I will certainly undertake to see whether we can do that. All of the documents pertaining to the elections are sealed in bags that are for the 343 districts. There are 77,000 polling divisions, each having their bag. And if they're in there, it would be years to collect all of them without any specific, inquiry into a particular polling
Okay,
division.
if I got back to you then with a subset of ridings, would that be helpful?
It certainly would be, but again, with the undertaking on a best effort, but the implications could be very significant, especially as we prepare for a possible election that can happen at any time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here again, Mr. Perrault. I questioned your predecessor when he was here about what it would take logistically and from a staffing perspective for Elections Canada to actually specifically check all 100 signatures for each candidate are in fact unique. He didn't want to comment on your operations now that you run the show, so I will put the same question to you. What, from a staffing perspective, would that take for Elections Canada to be able to do that if 100 unique signatures were imposed as a requirement?
So I want to be clear that I do not envisage doing that, in the sense that certainly this is not something that could take place in the few hours that involve the nomination process, right? The verification of the nomination process. Currently, returning officers go through the 100 signatures to make sure that there are 100 and that they are attached to people who are resident in the electoral district. That is the requirement. To then compare with other nomination papers is not something that could be done in the time.
So then how would you propose enforcing the 100 unique signatures per candidate?
So I think it's an important question. My view is that this should be enforced in case of organizers orchestrating. If I can use the word stunt that has been used before this committee, orchestrating campaigns to multiply candidates by using things.
I respect that, certainly, but I think the public is not going to trust the Longest Ballot Committee to police themselves, and I don't think we should as legislators either. So if it's not Elections Canada that will review the candidate signatures, would you support making the signatures public so that then at least the public could compare signatures from candidate to candidate to candidate, and if there are duplications, file a complaint with your organization?
Very quick answer, Mr. Perrault.
No, they are public right now. They can be examined in the office of the returning officer right now. I did not say we would not do examination. I said we would not systematically do examinations where we have cause to suspect that there is an activity. And to be quite frank, the activities to orchestrate the kind of initiative that we saw requires a fair amount of publicity. These are not things that happen under the radar. So it is not difficult to see how we could very well in those cases, intervene and do verifications and refer the cases to the commissioner as required.
I wanted to ask you a few questions and get some thoughts on what you think individuals or entities who assist or facilitate someone else's violation of a provision of the Canada's Elections Act, should they be held accountable under the Act? And if not, can you tell us why?
You may be referring to a recommendation of the former commissioner. I think there was a recommendation to that effect to have a general rule make sure that anytime there's an offense, that people who are assisting in the commission of that offense, that they can be caught under the Elections Act. Similarly to there are provisions elsewhere in other legislation that do that. Obviously, I would support that.
And should the scope of the Canada's Elections Act be extended so that the provisions would also apply to conspiracy attempts, counseling, contravention, or being an accessory after the fact to a violation of the Act?
I think that would be a sound approach, yes.
Okay. Currently, the Canada Elections Act bans third parties from accepting foreign contributions for the purpose of conducting regulated activities, but it does not prohibit foreign entities from giving such contributions. Where do you see the challenges lie within these provisions right now, and what gaps it poses?
I think it's simply a matter of being more comprehensive in the rules, that if we don't want foreign money to come in, that sometimes the person who receives the money may not be aware, but the person who gives certainly is. So you want to make sure, I think Parliament would want to make sure that the rules cover both the person, the entity who receives money, that unwittingly in some cases may be foreign in source, and the person the foreigner who attempts or delivers that money to the campaigns.
So are you saying that the law should be amended to prohibit?
Correct. That was a recommendation that I made in certainly in the last fall. I don't think it was in my 2022 report, but last fall it was.
I want to follow up on the complaint of Mr. Davies. It certainly is not satisfactory that a legitimate, serious complaint went into you don't agree with my characterization of a black hole, but I don't know what else it could be called other than a black hole when it goes into a security filter system and then isn't checked upon. And it really begs the question, how many other complaints raising issues of potential violations of the Canada Elections Act and so on go into Elections Canada's security filter and are not acted upon?
Mr. Chair, I think that's a legitimate question. It's certainly one that I've asked my team, and I think we need to look into that. We need to make sure both that there is security, but that there are means to making sure that if there are serious allegations of wrongdoing, that this not be lost through the security protection. So it's a balance.
Now, respectfully, I do find it a little bit astounding. With the greatest of respect, I understand that there are security filters, but does Elections Canada not have processes in place to monitor those security filters, to check if emails that shouldn't have gone into them are then reviewed and forwarded on to the commissioner or acted upon as they should be, as opposed to sitting in a security filter?
So again, I've asked my team to examine that very
No, but I've asked you, are there processes in place?
I've asked to see what are the processes and what they can be done to be improved.
You don't know that there are processes in place about Elections Canada's security filters with respect to complaints that are sent to info@elections.ca.
This is the first time that the situation has been brought to my attention, and I realize...
No, but it doesn't sound like it is necessarily an isolated case. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that when you have a security filter, that emails sometimes go into security filters that aren't junk mail, and so it just seems to me to be unacceptable that there are no processes in place, because you can't point to any. I mean, it should be pretty straightforward, shouldn't it be?
Again, I've asked that this be examined and that I be briefed on the matter, and I'd be happy to report back on the issue when I next appear.
Well, maybe you could answer how many other complaints have gone into that black hole.
So, I'm not aware of any, but that is something that needs to be examined. I do not disagree with you. It needs to be examined. In this case, as I've indicated, there are two other aspects, but it does not negate the legitimacy and the relevance of your question. In this case, the information, the Commissioner's office has been seized of the information.
It sounds to me like it is staggering incompetence. It sounds to me like there is a complete lack of oversight in place. to ensure that complaints are acted upon, and I can say it certainly doesn't leave me with a great sense of confidence in how Elections Canada is handling complaints about potential violations, potential serious violations of the Canada Elections Act, complaints that raise issues that go to the integrity of our elections and how they are being handled.
Mr. Chair, with all due respect, I think it's premature to draw those conclusions, but it is not. But if I may answer, I would like to answer, please. It is not premature to examine the issue internally, to see what needs to be done, and to do it to make sure that serious offences are not, serious complaints are not ignored. As I said, in this case, the subject matter was brought to the attention of the Commissioner, and perhaps it was determined that it was sufficient to do that. I won't.
Thank you.
Right? And as I said, in this particular case, allegations of a blank signature, if I could, of a non-candidates being identified is not an offence, and that needs to be addressed.
Thank you so much, Mr. Perrault.